What's up, guys? We're back again with another episode. Today we got my main man, Mr. A. This man is the Paul to my Timothy. He walked me through everything in my faith journey. He's just been a mentor throughout this whole thing. And it took a bit of convincing to have him on, but he's a natural with the camera. Don't let him fool you.
Yeah, I was born for it. What can I say?
Mr. A.
Yes.
Are you excited to be on?
Yeah. You, when you initially asked me to do this, I'm kind of weird about stuff like this, but I asked you if it meant a lot to you if I would do it, and you said yes. So naturally, here I am doing it for you. So
exactly. It'll mean a lot to a bunch of people on here. I'm sure a lot of your kids from high school will be watching this, so that'll be awesome.
Maybe so.
Speaking about high school, Mr. A, the question we all want to know, how was high school and college? What was that experience like for you? I feel like that's something we don't talk about a lot.
How was high school for me and how was college for me?
Yeah.
Oh my gosh. I don't know. It's been a long time ago. When you get to my age now, I'm 28. I started teaching when I was 22. You look back and you realize that you're in high school 10 years ago. And that's when I graduated, and there's 4 years on top of that. So I don't know. How was high school for me? Rambunctious, for sure. I don't know. Maybe I was a bit of a goofy goober. Was very, very passionate about athletics. And then other than that, as it pertains to my faith, I had a good youth minister, David Moore. He's pretty active in the Guyman community. A lot of people would be familiar with who that is. He was my youth pastor growing up, and I was pretty grounded most of the time. But just a rambunctious kid that was just looking to have some fun, make some people laugh and stuff like that. It's kind of high school in a nutshell. Other than, growing in my faith and having good friends and stuff, I was very athletically focused on things of that manner. But,
do you say it was athletically focused? Would you say that you had a bit of faith in your life, or was that kind of just here or there?
No, I would say...
When did that faith come into play? Really?
Ever since I was little, my circumstances growing up are unique. Just in general, a lot of things happened. Good, a lot of things happened that not so good. Bad, you might say. But even from an early age in my life, faith found me. And then from that point forward, I had always been committed to my faith, but maybe distracted at times. I always knew that Jesus loved me and he died for my sins. But I think distracted would be a good word to use, especially in high school, just because you're experiencing so many things for the first time. I was involved with our FCA, I was involved with our youth group, but as it pertains to leadership and things like that, it wasn't necessarily just outwardly vocal. It wasn't until my end of my senior year to where I really began looking towards leadership in my faith, if that makes sense. But up until that point, it was just about, having a good time, having fun, focusing on athletics and things like that. So
that makes sense. That's a big jump, though, to just be here or there with your faith and then to actually starting the youth ministry. I know that meant a lot to me, is having a youth ministry to come to, especially whenever I was dealing with a bunch of stuff here as I came to Goodwill, and YJ was kind of just already there for me. When did that take place? When did you finally get that calling from the Lord that led you to start a ministry for younger kids, just a ministry in general? Okay.
So ministry in general, it was my senior summer, going into college, that we were at False Creek, and usually, like I was saying a while ago, I'm a pretty rambunctious guy. But that week was a little bit different for me. I could really feel like the Lord was dealing with me. And it ended out that week, the culmination of all that was me feeling like I had a called ministry on my life, and I responded to that and accepted that. No clue what it looks like. You're 18 and you think you're on top of the world. But I just knew that there was a call of ministry on my life. And, I went into college, made some mistakes here and there while in the first bit of my college career, and then immediately got refocused on faith and, reigniting, there's this call to ministry on my life. What is this? And exploring that. And then at about 18, 19, I started serving here in this building, the MSC, as an intern. And one thing leads to another. We end up being the directors of the building, and haven't really looked back since. But the nature of your question was, how did YGI start? My first year at Goodwill, when I was 22, my first semester was really rough as a teacher, just because I didn't really know what I was doing. I kind of got thrown into the fire. Didn't have much mentorship in the way of being shown how to do things as a teacher. So I was kind of at my wit's end. And around that time, I got a phone call from a senior pastor about being a youth pastor in Guyman. And I was like, well, maybe, I've done ministry in college for this long and I kind of got my feet about me in it. Maybe this is something I should explore, something I should look into. And just being diligent to, cover my bases and see it through to make sure, is it God's will? Is it not God's will for my life? I went through the entire process, interview process, meeting in front of the SPRC board, stuff like that. Met the kids and the families and whatnot. And was pretty close to just making that decision to leave teaching and just go into full-time ministry. And I just was praying about it, really seeking God's face in it. God, is this what you want me to do? God, is this what you want me to do? And one thing that I'm really big on, and I think you know this from coming up through the ministry, is always seeking wisdom from people who are wiser than you, good, godly wisdom. And I was talking to various people, and I remember I called my uncle, hey, I'm at the point now to whether I accept this job or I keep teaching. And, we talked about various other things. And, he just said, you just be sure that is what God has for you, taking this job, and that you're not running away from something. And, after hearing that, I spent some more time in prayer, and God made it very clear that hey, I want you to be involved in youth ministry. This is something I have for you, as well as your college ministry, but not in this way. And I was like, okay. And then I just, I declined the job. And that next day, I was kind of okay, wow, I really just declined an opportunity to do full-time vocational ministry. And I was like, oh, was that the right move?
Right.
And then I thought some more about it, and not even that next day, it was like a fire God ignited in me. I was like, I need to do youth ministry. And sometimes I'm pretty gung-ho. If I say I'm going to do something and I know it's from God, it's happening, especially if I know it's God's told me to do this. And I felt like God told me to start a youth ministry. And then I called a pastor in town and said, hey, I'm doing this. Do you want in on it? He's like, yeah, we would like in on it. We'll support you where we can. And then I think it was that next week, we started the YGI ministry. So
wow, that's awesome.
Yeah.
I'm sure a lot of people haven't heard, or maybe a lot of people don't know about that tough, rough patch in your first semester where you said, or your first year, where you said you were almost at a point where you about quit. And I want to talk about track a little bit too.
Sure, yeah.
I'm sure
we can get there.
That's what you were kind of turning down also, if you were to accept that full-time ministry and knowing how much of an impact track has meant to you. What was that thing that kept you here? What kept you here, and for you to turn down a full-time ministry where also you may have thought that could have been something?
Sure, yeah. One of the big things that I think needs to be clarified, when I interviewed for the job at Goodwill, and I got the job at Goodwill, I sat across from my principal and I told him, don't ask me to coach, I won't coach. It's not something I have an interest in doing, because there was a fear in me that if I started to coach, it would pull me away from ministry. A lot of people may not realize the amount of work that goes into doing a full-time collegiate ministry. Not at the time when I said that, but a full-time youth ministry as well. There's a lot of background stuff that you don't see. But I was totally against coaching when I first started teaching. I was very passionate about being a teacher, and I just kind of ended up coaching. So to clarify that point, restate your question now that I've clarified that so I can answer it clearly.
So I guess now the question would be, what kept you at Goodwill knowing that there was such an opportunity, or what kept you committed to something that was hard, right? Because I'm sure you could have quit and you could have accepted this huge time offer. What was that motivation? What was that spark there?
To be honest, I wouldn't pick very many ways to describe myself, just because I don't like necessarily talking about myself or how I view myself, but I'm loyal to a fault. And I know that it's very, very evident in my life and just the way that God's orchestrated the universe that I'm in Goodwill because he's put me here and he has a purpose for me here. And there is a calling on my life to serve this community and serve it all the way through. Not just God called me to serve this community, do it for 2 years, and then look for where God's calling me next. Is I know that God's planted me here in order to help grow this place, help grow the youth of this place, and be passionately sold out for the kids of Goodwill. And that's why I stayed. That's why I'm still here. To dive a little bit deeper into it, growing up in Texoma and viewing Goodwill it's not necessarily that like we grew up viewing it as less than or anything like that. It's just always like, oh, there's Goodwill. And then once I got into the community, I realized that the community needed people to be sold out for it. The kids needed somebody to believe in them. The kids needed somebody to help grow them in their faith, to love them and care for them and nurture them. And around the time that I made the decision to start YGI and God put it on my heart to do that, that solidified. It's kind of like if you've ever seen like a puzzle and there's been a piece missing and then that piece just fits perfectly. It's like that puzzle piece fit in, like, oh, that's why I'm here. I'm here for these kids. I'm here to benefit them and their growth, and treat this place as a launching pad out into the world, because as much as we would love for people to continually come back and invest into this community, it's just not something that happens. So I've sold myself out for God's calling on my life to help build up the youth of this community so that they don't get left out and they don't get missed.
Awesome. That means a lot. I'm sure it means a lot to the community, but also to the kids, like you mentioned.
That's what it's about, man. It's all about the kids.
Right. Yeah. To have somebody who's young, who's pretty swaggy, who's got that fire to him, to come to Goodwill, right? Because I'm sure somebody else could have came and, done a little bit of this, a little bit of that, and then left. But somebody who's got that swag, who's young, who's here to invest things, that kind of motivates the kids to be like, okay, there's something here. There's something that I can look forward to here, is a coach who cares, who's going to put time and work into that. So, yeah, I'm sure a lot of kids would like to thank you for that. And some of the kids who've left Goodwill also, they definitely, enjoyed that, and it's meant a lot to them. But I also want to ask you about ministry, since we were talking about it, and that call to ministry. Somebody who's young, I'm sure there might be somebody who's young listening who is saying, okay, I'm young, but I still feel like the Lord has a calling in my life to go into ministry, but I don't know what that looks like. How do you discern whether the Lord's calling you to ministry, or maybe you think you're too young, or this or that? How would you know? So
how do you discern the call, and how do you know if you're being called into ministry? That's a tough question. I don't know. I akin it to when you know. I knew very, very clearly, like in the moment, that, how do I describe it? It's almost like they do calls for salvation and they do calls for ministry and all these things. And it was just very, very clearly that it felt like God looked at me and said, hey, I need you to be a warrior for my kingdom. I need you to be sold out for me. And it just, in that moment, it was clear. It's hard to say or give advice on, like, how do you know? How do you know? How do you know? Because we're so obsessed with just like, that was the moment, that was the time, that was the second that it happened. And there are moments like that in life, but being a Christian is being sensitive to the inclinations of the Holy Spirit, and just feeling a move and feeling a nudge towards something, and then discerning, is that God's will? Is that my will? Where am I at in that? For me, it was just simple as I knew that I knew. And then once I know that God's called me to something, I don't let anything get in my way from it. And then the next practical step after that would be, how do I actually get involved with doing ministry? Well, if you're scared because you're young, stop. You don't need to be. Timothy's clear with that. Paul's very, very clear in what he's telling Timothy. Just like you do ministry, you lead and you serve, because that's what you're called to do. You don't have to have age. You don't have to have X, Y, and Z to solidify your position. No, you don't need that. You need a heart that loves God and a heart that's willing to serve God. And then from there, the ministry flows. Awesome. It's a matter of the heart to begin with, is what I would say. Awesome.
Well, that's encouraging to hear. We talked about track earlier. I'm going to ask you about track now.
Sure.
Because you said that wasn't why you stayed, but we can obviously tell that you're super passionate about track. What is it about track and field that you're so obsessed with? And could you tell us something about track and field that you see in it that we don't?
Sure. There's lots of things. From a coaching standpoint, I'm obsessed with track and field just because every kid is different. And the way that they have to be trained is different in most cases than somebody else. Every kid is a new case. Every kid leads to more study of biomechanics and biochemistry of, well, how do I need to train them to get the outcome that they want? Another reason why I'm obsessed with it is because for me in my own career, I was lucky enough in high school to experience a lot of success. And I remember how that made me feel. I remember how all the hard work that I had put in for all those years finally came to a very good culmination at the end of my career. And just what that meant to me. And track's a hard sport, and it's not an easy sport. It's not a team sport necessarily. It's largely individual. You collect points as you go. But one of the reasons why I'm obsessed, the main reason why I'm obsessed is because I want every kid that I have the opportunity to coach to reach whatever athletic potential that I can get them to. And then seeing that all the way through. I want to see them reach as far as they can reach and actually guide and help them get there. I don't want my kids to be good in spite of me. I want my kids to improve because I aided in the process. And seeing that improvement leads to more and more obsession. I'm not necessarily consumed with winning at all. I'm actually very far detached from winning, but I want to see my kids succeed and improve. And in track and field, that's as simple as, getting a faster time just by a little bit or just throwing just a little bit further. But those little improvements help the kids understand that if I do work at something, I do get better.
Right.
So to answer your first question, I mean, I could sit here and I could talk about why I'm obsessed with it all day, but that would be largely one of the big reasons right there.
Awesome. And then my second question, what's something about track and field that that we might not know and that we're kind of missing?
So I have a rule in my program. When you're a freshman and you come into my program, you have to do one of two races. You either run the 400 or you do the 300 hurdles. And the reason why is because one of the intrinsic things about track and field is that out of all the sports, it is one of the best sports to prepare you for life. Because at the end of a 400, your legs hurt, your body hurts, you can't breathe all that well, you're suffering and you're in pain. And mentally, there's moments to where you can just say, oh, I'm going to check out. I'm going to slow down because the pain is too much, because I can't really handle this. And there's a great opportunity for you to pull back in those moments. But there's an even greater opportunity for you to learn to lean into that, to say, I know it hurts. I know it's tough. Things aren't looking good right now. Right. This is the end of the 400. It's that last 100 meters. It's the hardest thing in the world.
Exactly. You start seeing butterflies and stuff.
You're right. Yeah, you've been there. But as a coach, you can nurture that moment. And that moment is a defining moment. Each time that you do that race, you find out who you're going to be. You find out what your character is going to be. And through that, as a coach, you can nurture that process to help kids really get set up for life. Because if I'm being honest, when I was trained as an athlete and when I ran some races, I go back to some of those practices that I did or some of those races that I ran, and I'm like, dang, I got through that. I did that. I can get through this next thing too. And then pairing that with your faith, God's got me, I'm tough, I've trained, I've prepared. Like, that's just a beautiful mixture of how you can really be a coach and influence lives as well. Nice. I would say it's the intrinsic value of really learning a lot about yourself.
Awesome. That's really good. I also like the fact that you said that whenever you coach, Coach Prime said this. Are you familiar with?
Yeah.
Okay. He says this all the time, how you have to adjust to each kid that you're coaching, because you might need to yell at that kid, but you might just need to give this kid a hug.
Yeah,
right.
Sure.
It's you have to know your kid, and that's
1000%.
The beauty of coaching, is having that relationship with each kid.
Yeah, and I think one of the not necessarily a lost art of coaching, but I'm so far removed from the desire to have accolades for myself as a coach. Like, I feel like most coaches get into the game to win and influence some lives and stuff like that. I could care less about that, mainly due to the fact that we can dive into like my why for like everything like that. But a lot of these kids that I coach in Goodwell, and even some of these kids in the college that I help with, like, they just need somebody to believe in them. They need somebody to love them. They need somebody to push them. They need somebody to guide them. And really, that's the vehicle that track and field is for me. Is it gives me an opportunity to not only spend more time with these kids, but to truly love these kids. And that's the biggest thing for me. Like, from a ministry standpoint, you know this because you came up through YGI, and my college kids know this. But like, I love these kids. Like, Goodwell kids, I love them. College kids, I love them. Kids that allow me to have a place in their life. When I say that I love you, you know this. And it's important because that love comes from Christ loving us first. Right. And it's an outpouring of that love that's within us. Right. So when it comes to coaching and coaching kids differently, is yes, absolutely. There's times to where I'm harder on some kids, but no matter what, everything that I do as a coach will be tempered with love. Right. I'm not going to get into your face. I'm not going to beat you down. I'm not going to do anything like that. I'm just going to love you through the process, sometimes more firm, but you'll never be missing the aspect of love, because I feel like when Jesus walked the earth in his ministry, he never lost his aspect of love.
And I think that's one thing that's really evident about you, and maybe you can speak a little bit more on that. But whenever you think of a coach, you think about a coach screaming and yelling in your face.
Sure.
And whenever you think of you, I can't ever really remember a time where you ever raised your voice or screamed.
Mm-hmm.
Why would you say that you're different than other coaches in that aspect? When another coach will yell at you, your way is so much different, because
Sure.
I've never heard you raise your voice, but you have a subtle
Sure.
way of just getting your point across without having to get to that level.
It's dynamic in nature whenever you ask the question that way. I don't know why other coaches motivate that way or feel like that's the best way to go about it. I think perhaps it's because what was done to them. And I'm a very against the standard kind of person. I fully acknowledge that there's a time and a place for that kind of encouragement. But as for me and the way that I do things is I'm not going to ever do that. Due to the fact that just as much as really yelling at a kid or using fear as a motivator or anything like that, love's a more powerful motivator.
Right.
I feel like if my kids understand that I really love them and I really care about them, if I need them to go a little bit harder, that motivator of love is just as powerful as a motivator of fear or disappointment or anything like that. And I don't feel the need to be aggressive. I don't feel the need to slam things down or get in a kid's face or yell at them or anything like that. Now,
For sure.
don't mix any of this for like, programs being soft or me being soft towards kids. Is I love them, but one thing that my kids know is a standard, and we uphold a high standard. It's non-negotiable either, and there are consequences. But
no, that's true, because you can say, just go run 5 more 400s.
Yeah,
you're not yelling, but it's hard, and that's the standard.
Sure.
No, I get that. But you talked about love, and one thing that I like to get into with all my guests who have a Christ-centered relationship is how they got into that relationship. You've been in a relationship since college, right?
Yeah, 10 years.
And it's been a Christian-centered relationship. That's a relationship that everybody who comes around YGI, who's raised around YGI, is under, is that parenthood of you and Mama Mac.
Sure.
And so what advice would you give to somebody striving to have that Christian relationship or striving to find that one for them through Christ? What would you give? What advice would you give to them?
Two
or what
things.
do you have to say?
2 things. If you truly want to have a Christ-centered relationship, you have to love Christ more than your significant other. That's the bottom line. The second bit of encouragement is more of a question. Is how bad do you want it? How bad do you really want a Christ-centered relationship? Because the desires of the flesh are strong. And when it pertains to relationship, we could talk about arguing, we could talk about lust, we could talk about many, many things. But even in our own Christian faith, the flesh is very strong, and the desires of it are strong too. And in a relationship, that's what you're combating, is the desires of that flesh. But if you love Jesus more than you love your significant other, you're not going to do things that are against his will. And it's very, very clear what those things are. And when I ask you the question, how bad do you want it? What are you willing to sacrifice in order to have a Christ-centered relationship?
That's good.
Are you really willing to lay things down at the foot of the cross, your desires of your flesh, in order to have a sanctified relationship? Like, it just boils down to that simple question. Like, a lot of people, and I counsel a lot of couples, and we talk a lot about this in the college atmosphere and in the high school atmosphere. But if your basis isn't Christ to begin with, and you're hoping for it to come in the middle, you're already in a bad way. But you have to buckle down, and your desire for a relationship with Christ has to be more than your desire for a relationship with that significant other. And then intertwining Christ in the middle of it, and how you love them and how you serve them, is whenever you really start to take off in the relationship.
That's good. That's awesome. That's some good advice right there. And I think that perfectly transitions us into the next question. I wanted to hear your opinions on faith and action. Having faith and then also implementing action into that, because you can have faith that you're gonna find a Christ-centered woman, but then your actions might not lead to that. Or you can say, I'm gonna be a state champ, but you're not putting action into that. There has to be action behind the faith. Or you can say, whatever's gonna happen is gonna happen. I'm just gonna do my thing. But you have to have action behind your faith, because that's what Christ calls us to do.
Word. Yeah, talk is cheap, man. Talk is cheap. My whole life, the way that I've geared it, the way that I've tried to go about it, is to avoid that exact thing, that talk is cheap. So many people want to sit and talk about I want the Christ-centered relationship. Some people want to sit and talk about, I want to be a state champion.
Right.
But when it's time to do what it takes to have those things, people fold pretty quickly. And all it is I keep things super simple, Vic. You know this because, like I said earlier, you came up through the ministry, but there's no sense in overcomplicating it.
Right.
Because the solution is very, very simple. It's you just do it.
Right.
Like, if you want to be a state champion, you have to ask state champions, what did it take to be a state champion? And then from there, you have to do the things they did. Maybe not the same way, maybe slightly different. But if you want to have a Christ-centered relationship, talk to people that have one,
Right.
then do what they did. And to tell you the truth, when it comes to a relationship, Timothy talks about fighting the good fight. Paul references that he's fought the good fight. I mean, a lot of times in our faith, you have to view it as a bare-knuckled fight. Like, if you're trying to keep the faith, especially in a relationship where those desires of the flesh, things like lust, are so powerful, you may have to get up and leave.
Yeah.
You may have to fight the good fight. You may have to bare your knuckles and say, I love you, but I got to go for now.
Yeah.
So,
That's
if that makes
good.
sense.
No, that's good. That's some good words right there.
But I mean, I don't know.
Bars.
Talk is cheap, man. Talk
Yes,
is
sir.
cheap. You
I
got to
like
be
that.
about that action.
Yeah.
Be about that life.
For sure. I think that there's a difference between saying, yeah, that's what God wants for me, and just leaving it at that. And then, yeah, that's what God wants for me. This is what I'm going to do to achieve that.
Right. As in for faith in action, like, our society kind of has it a little mixed up because we live in such a consumer mentality society. Like, we go to Sundays and we get a service, and that's great for us for the week. Now we're good until the next week. Or we go to youth on Wednesdays and we consume a little bit of scripture and a message, and then we go about our life.
Right.
But the one thing that we've tried to build YGI on is that just consuming it's not enough. What are you going to do with it now that you have it? How are you going to go out and better your fellow man? How are you going to spread the love of Christ? How are you going to evangelize to the lost? How are you going to tell your friends? How are you going to tell your family about what God's done in your life? Because just hearing it and consuming it is all well and good, and I'm happy for you. But we live in a world to where we got to be servants.
Right.
And you can't serve if you're sitting on the sideline.
Exactly.
So
that's good stuff right there.
get in the game.
Yes, sir. Okay, now I'm going to ask you a Bible question.
Okay.
So,
Is this like a deep theological question?
well, it could be, but also it could be whatever you make of it. So I'm going to
Okay.
ask you the question, and then I'm going to ask you another question on top of that. So the first
Okay.
question is, what is your favorite book in the Bible?
Favorite book in the Bible?
Right.
That's such a tough question. There's so many.
Yeah.
When it comes to book, it's tough to answer. I'm pretty sold out on 1st and 2nd Timothy. I also like Peter a lot, all the epistles of Peter. I would say those two. I enjoy Romans a lot, but Romans is kind of a lot to consume at one time. Just a lot of information in there. In the Gospels, I love the Gospel of John. So
There's one you forgot to mention that you mentioned.
Philemon.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right.
It's my favorite to go back and read. I actually read it this morning.
Really?
Yeah.
Well, that's good because I have a question to you about that.
Okay.
I prepared the question, and so the letter it's a unique and it's a personal one, right?
Yeah.
From Paul to a slave owner regarding the runaway, right? Okay. So it's kind of a little bit about how he wrote in Romans, but it's a little bit different because it's kind of just like me and you sitting down right here.
Sure. It's a very personal conversation
Right.
between Philemon and Paul.
So it's similar to Romans, but it's also a little bit different. So
Sure.
what insights have you gained, or what have you taken from Paul through reading that book over and over, and what was going on? What do you think was going through his head while writing that?
I think when it comes to Paul writing to Philemon about the slave, it's hard to say his name. Onesimus, I think is how you say it correctly. Onesimus. When he's writing about Onesimus to Philemon, I find it interesting because Onesimus is a runaway slave. He fled from Philemon, and that's just a pretty tough situation to be in general, because why is he fleeing? All these questions arise and stuff. But Onesimus, he fled, and he somehow came into contact with Paul. And at this time that Paul's writing this letter, he's under house arrest. And the interpretation and the understanding is that Onesimus served Paul during this house arrest, not necessarily as a servant, but as a brother in Christ. He would do things for him, because in Roman times, whenever you were under house arrest, you couldn't leave, but you could have visitors. So you could take people in, but you couldn't go out yourself unless it was under heavy supervision or anything like that. So imagine Onesimus was doing errands for Paul, was helping Paul, getting things here and there, and then become a true brother in Christ to Paul. And throughout that process, they became bonded and close. But in lieu, and this is the beautiful part of it, but in lieu of Christ's forgiveness that he extends to us, Paul recognizes that Philemon needs to have the opportunity to extend Christ's forgiveness or forgiveness in general towards Onesimus. So he's urging Onesimus to head home, to go back to where he ran away from, and give Philemon the opportunity to forgive him. So that's just the reason why I like reading that letter, and the reason why I like studying that letter. Number one, it's short. It's easy to consume. You can read it in one setting. But there's just a lot packed in there. Yeah. There's some authority from Paul that he talks about. He says essentially, I could command you to do this, but I'm not going to. I'm going to ask you to do it out of love. And that's a big pillar for me in my own faith, is like, you know, whenever you're in a position of power over somebody, you can command them to do something, but you might get a better response if you ask them to do it out of love.
Yeah, for sure. Because
that's the way Christ would have done it. And the whole idea of forgiveness and redemption between Philemon and Onesimus, and Paul being the mediator between that, making these two people reunite. I don't know. It just, it's good.
That's good.
It makes me feel good when I read it.
So much wisdom. And that from the Bible is probably where you get the most wisdom.
Without a doubt.
For your teaching, for your coaching, whatever it is. Yeah. So if you're into teaching, coaching, whatever it is, man, a living testament of it right here. And just gets all his wisdom from the Bible. So
right.
All right, Ms. Stray, I have two questions in one. I'm going to ask you one, and then I'm going to ask you the other.
Okay.
So what is something in your faith walk that has faced a challenge to you? What have you had a hard time wrapping your mind around when it comes to your relationship with Christ and just...
Without getting too much into my own testimony, why God does what he does. That's been my biggest hurdle. Early on, I came to peace with it a long time ago. But early on in my life, you know, I experienced a lot of loss. And I mean, shoot, even into my adult life, I've experienced a lot of loss of people that were around me or supposed to take care of me or love me or things like that. Things that were organically supposed to pan out the way that they do for a lot of people did not pan out that way for me. Anything from, you know, paternal relationship with my parents to many, many other things. The understanding or questioning why God does what he does. When I was younger, that led to a lot of anger, anger out of confusion and lack of understanding. But now as I'm older, I understand that God has a very, very deep plan for you. His ways are higher than ours.
Right.
One of my favorite things to reference back to is in Job. I can't remember the verse exactly, but essentially Job's complaining about all the things that are happening to him, and respectfully, Job was having a rough time.
Exactly.
But he's complaining to God, and God essentially rebuttals with, "Where were you when I laid the foundations of the earth?" And just, dang, man, like that hurdle becomes so much smaller when I realize whatever God is doing, it's above my pay grade. I don't need to worry about it. I mean, can it hurt? Yeah. Can it be confusing? For sure. But at the end of the day, I have to acknowledge that I'm a servant unto his kingdom. I have to acknowledge his plan and that his ways are higher than mine. And I have to submit myself to that and be obedient to it out of love, no matter how much it may hurt or be challenging or be difficult, but to fully submit to God's plan for my life. Because where was I when he laid the foundations of the earth, you know?
Yeah.
So
I think one of the most beautiful things that I have to do whenever I'm facing something challenging, well, I guess it's not beautiful in the moment. Whenever I look back at it, then I'm kind of grateful for the moment. But whenever I'm faced with something difficult, I start to get lost in, it's hard to explain, but I start to get lost in the actual problem, and I start to actually forget who God is. But even though it's hard in the moment to just kind of scope out, zoom out and say, okay, that's who God is. He's brought me through this. It's hard in the moment to kind of zoom out. But once I just say it, just forget about it all, zoom out, who is God? And then what he's done for me in the past, what he's created. If he created this whole world, this whole universe, what can he do? And so it just makes the problem so much smaller. Right. So I think whenever you put it in that perspective, it really is. It's challenging in the moment to do, but once you do it, it kind of puts you at ease to just literally just leave it at his feet, and that's it.
100%. I think one of the best things to understand is we're not the main character. One of the things that freed me the most in ministry was fully understanding it's not about me. Right. It has nothing to do with me. I could desire to be a multi-time state champion coach. I could desire to have 80 people in YGI and 120 in the college worship. I could have all these desires and things and whatnot, but it's not about me at all. It's about God and what he's doing. So continuing to just submit to that, saying, God, your ways are higher than mine. I trust you.
That's good. That's good. Okay, now to bring it into a lighter note, what has convinced you the most about your faith? What has been that thing that has just made you convinced in your faith? Saying, I'm going to keep fighting this fight.
Like I was saying, I remember sharing something on social media not too long ago, and it kind of put that question into perspective, like what keeps me going in my faith, what makes me sure of my faith. And it's the goodness in the kids that are around me and the people that are around me. It's just seeing God's grace over their life, seeing how their lives transform. I mean, you're a good example of that. Like what God's done in your life is undeniable evidence that God exists.
Right.
It's undeniable evidence that Christ can change lives and things of that nature. Yeah. And there's tons of other case studies you could look at of people that I've been able to encounter, but seeing like that light bulb switch on for people, that's probably the number one thing that I'm like, dang, God is good. I can't believe, I say often, I can't believe this is my life. I can't believe I get to do this.
Exactly.
So
yeah, that's a really encouraging thing. I'm glad that you point that out. Is obviously whenever I'm struggling with my faith too, I start to look around and say, how is God moving in other people's lives? Because as you said earlier, it's not all about me. I'm not the main character. So how is God moving in other people's lives around me?
Sure.
And let me just look to see how good God has been to them also.
Right.
Because I may think that God's not doing anything in my life right now, even though he is. If I look at other people's lives, if I see what he's doing in their lives, that's undeniable that he's working and that he's doing good things in their lives too.
It's so like Waymaker, dude, even when I don't see it.
Exactly. I always kind of subtly mention it, but I don't want to start singing the song, but
yeah, you definitely
low-key, the lyrics are coming from there for sure. Yeah, definitely. All right, Mr. A, we've been going for a minute. It's been great chatting with you. My final question is, what piece of advice or what would you like to end it off or leave us with that has been significant in your life and that when people watch this, they can clip it?
Get you a clip. The best piece of advice, man, it's just, for me, that's so hard to say. Just because I believe life is meant to be lived with people. And the advice comes as you go. And there's bits and pieces that you get here and there. So saying that one piece of advice is like this big old light bulb moment for people or anything like that's hard for me. But if there's one piece of advice that I could give anybody that listens to this is that never forget that our faith requires obedience, but the obedience comes from love. And it's the love of Christ that leads us to obedience. Right. Nothing more, nothing less. But it starts with love and ends with love.
Right. That's good. And I think that just ties in perfectly with Phileo. I know you talk a lot about it, and that's something that's really important to you. You keep mentioning love, and that's something that's very evident that you stand for and that you like to kind of get across. So that's awesome right there.
100%.
All right. Is there anything else that you would like to plug before we end this out? Would you like to plug? Would you like to leave us with anything?
No, run track and field. All right.
Okay. Run track and field.
Do track and field. It's worth it. Come check out YGI if you can. It's a good time. If you're in college, MSC's Tuesday nights during the fall and spring semester. So
awesome. Yeah. I'll put all those links down in the description to all those social medias, and y'all go check it out. But yeah, that's a wrap.
Cool.
Yes, sir.
Peace. That was a clean dap.
That was a clean dap.